Hi, I'm Stanley Goldberg, host of the Inquiring Mind podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you're new here, I release 2 episodes a week with a variety of fascinating guests, and I would appreciate if you would support my podcast by liking this video and subscribing down below. Thank you for your support, and now to today's guest. Branko Milanovic, welcome to the Inquiring Mind podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure, actually, to be here.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. This is the last episode I'm going to do of the year. It's going to come out in the new year, obviously, because you know. But I wanted to start with something. You're a world-renowned economist. You've written multiple books on economics, but I wanted to start with kind of your origin story. You grew up in the former Yugoslavia. How did your upbringing in the former Yugoslavia shape your view on economics?
Yeah, it is indeed a very good question. And actually, I have more recently started thinking about that. I have not really thought very much of that before because, you live your life, you're not exactly sort of thinking every minute, like why your life is exactly like the way it is. Um, I think it actually shaped it in two different ways. First of all, like it is useful to have more experience and to have lived in different countries and different political systems. You realize that after the fact, because it does give you a little bit of a broader understanding of what people experience under different conditions. But I always had a very strong interest in politics and in social affairs, if I can put it like that. For example, I remember even when I was like, I think 9 or 10, I was very sort of politically sort of interested. In those days, it was mostly about foreign policy. And then also about social issues. Uh, and then there are, I think, two other developments which happened. The first one, when at university we studied, of course, Marx at the first and the second year. And studying Marx, even first from the textbooks and after that from reading him, although he's very difficult to read, so it's not easy. So you really have to have somebody give you a textbook approach and then you start reading. You realize that economics is really about the succession of different socioeconomic formations and how the economics is driving that change. So it's very different from studying micro and macro, where you deal with very mundane issues in some sense. Here, you deal with sort of a basically history of the world. And then, and of course, if you have interest in social issues and class issues, then Marx actually fits that quite well. Even as you know, there were application of Marxist approach to socialist economies that actually the argument being that they're class-based, but the basis of the classes are different from capitalist economies where the basis is the ownership of private capital. And to end the question, the second influence on me was when I was reasonably good in mathematics, so I actually studied statistical part of economics, and that's where I discovered the Gini, coefficient, the Lorentz curve, and that somehow provided for me a methodological or actually technical uh, instruments to study the issues of social differentiation that to which I came through interest in social issues and Marx. So to summarize it, it was, I think, really basically the combination of interest in social issues that where Marxism plays a very important role, with a technical ability to study them, where people like Gini and Lawrence and others provided, of course, the basis, and Pareto as well, technical basis to do that. So I would say this is a combination of these two things.
Yeah. So before we get to the kind of the economic side of it, you just mentioned that early in your life, at 9, 10 years old, you were really interested in politics. What made you get interested in politics? Was it the family conversations around the dinner table, or where it really caught your interest?
Yeah, I have not. Yeah, I think it's basically maybe dinner time conversations. My uh, my interest was actually more in foreign politics. Maybe the reason was also because my father, and of course I lived with my father and my mother, the early part of my life I spent in France. So then that was the time of quite a politically tense situation in France with Algerian independence. And what people have forgotten, France had actually very significant terrorist issues with the right-wing Organisation Armée Secrète, which were people who were trying to overthrow and actually kill several times the goal during after his decision to grant independence to Algeria. So it was a very sort of fraught period. On top of that, there was, of course, the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I think these issues made me, and then in 67, the Yom Kippur War. So these issues, I think, made me quite interested in politics, foreign politics. And then I think actually when I was older later, it led to more domestic and social issues. But I think it's probably the family influence. My grandmother, for example, was a huge reader of newspapers and all foreign news. And I think she influenced me as well. It's really simply this awareness of the rest of the world and of politics. And I have to, one more thing that I should not forget is Congo and Lumumba were very important, particularly in Yugoslavia, which is non-aligned, and where in school we got really quite a lot of how should I say, emphasis on the newly independent states in Africa, in Asia. And as you know, Tito was actually friends with many of those, people from non-alignment. So Congo was a big turning point also. The brutal murder of Lumumba was a big event. So it's good that you made me think of this. I haven't really thought of all these details before.
Yeah, I actually, this kind of ties into what I want to bring up next. And that's, I listened to a conversation that you had probably a few years ago now with a famous soccer writer. I know you're a fan of soccer and football and in the world, but with Simon Cooper, and there was I forget his name, Boban. I forget his first name. Yeah. But you had a conversation on Yugoslavia and how soccer affected it. But what I found interesting that you said is that you had this kind of identity crisis because Yugoslavia kind of fell apart and when you were 35 or so.
Right.
And you always viewed yourself as Yugoslavian, right? And I would imagine that's something, an issue people feel in Czechoslovakia, right? If around the same age, they always viewed themselves as such, and then they have to kind of figure out for themselves, or even the former Soviet Union, people kind of viewed this giant country or republic as their own, and then they have to be like, oh, I'm Ukrainian, I'm Uzbek, I'm whatever it is.
Right.
So, do you feel? Maybe this is a kind of a weird question, but do you feel like the fall of Yugoslavia was in some ways regrettable?
Yeah, it is a difficult question, and I have to say that let me go back to what you originally sort of started. Yes, I think there was a crisis that I went through. Some people did not, because if you really were feeling from the very beginning, for example, of your youth, let's suppose you felt Estonian, the Soviet Union, or you felt only Russian, or you felt Serb or Croat, then you don't have, actually, that was a nice conversation with Boban about football. For example, he was from essentially Croat, not in a negative sense, but Croat nationalist family. So they felt they really never belonged. So there was no identity crisis for them. For them, it was actually liberation. But if you didn't feel like that, and then you really do have an identity crisis, because you actually wonder, like, is everything that I believed that I was everything wrong? It's a little bit like a divorce. When you have divorcing, you have to think not only about what happened now you're divorcing, you're sort of thinking, was I wrong to have fallen in love before? Was it actually an illusion? So you start really reassessing your entire sort of thinking. And that was actually a very difficult period. And then now when I think of this, of course, my opinions are currently very different from the opinions that I had then, because I do think now actually that Yugoslavia was not a how should I say, a feasible option. And I actually now have the opinion that it should not have been formed in 1918 at all. So it's a very different opinion than I had in 1990. But as I said, it was nevertheless, clearly it's a difficult period. So when people sometimes very sort of easily discard, for example, when Putin said this was the greatest geopolitical tragedy, it's exaggerated because for many people it was not this tragedy. However, it's true also that for many people it was, and particularly people with mixed backgrounds. So, let's suppose you are both Russian and Ukrainian. Mother is Ukrainian, father is Russian. It's not an easy thing if the two countries go to war. And I had actually, in many cases in Yugoslavia, friends who were on mixed background. And it was very difficult for them and for their families to go through this.
Did you feel like you lost friends during that time?
I did not directly lose friends, and I was actually in the US, so I was really not directly affected. But certainly some links which existed became sort of weaker. In other words, people that, let's suppose, in the normal ordinary conditions of Yugoslavia before, let's suppose somebody comes from Croatia visiting Washington, they would call me. Right. So I would go and meet to have coffee and we would have joined friends and so on. Well, after 1990, they would not call me, So there was no really break. And personally, I didn't have any sort of a big issue, but you simply realize that there are people who would have normally seen and you don't see them.
Yeah. So I think the one incomplete part of that conversation that you had with Boban and Simon Cooper was the fact that you said you had an identity crisis, but I never felt like I got whether we like titles or we don't, right? We still feel certain associations to some kind of title, right? Like I consider myself, an American of Ukrainian descent. My parents are from the former Soviet Union. I'm American first and foremost, but then there are titles on top of it, right? I'm a podcaster. I'm this. I'm that. But what do you associate yourself still as, like Yugoslav or a Serbian or American?
No, I think actually associating with Yugoslavia is impossible because it simply just doesn't exist. It's
Right.
it's like a little bit like Roman Empire. I mean, you can associate yourself with Roman Empire, but it's kind of a little bit weird. You cannot, I think, also associate as a Soviet because it simply also doesn't exist. So yes, I'm actually sort of since I spent so much time in the United States, I associate myself with the United States, and also by background and by passport as a Serbian. So, but I have to say that neither of these two associations is. I don't know. There's maybe good or bad things. They are not really overwhelming my own, I think, actually, personality or opinions. So I would see them as relatively, if I can use that word, relatively weak associations. You might have some people with very strong association, and I think there are people with weaker. And I think actually with globalization and our ability to have many different passports, as you know, people now with COVID, I know quite a few American friends who have parents or cousins or so on, they could apply for foreign passports, and they were very keen to do that in the beginning of the crisis to allow themselves to travel, for example. So I think that there are many people who do have certain nationality, citizenship, and but these are what I would call relatively weakly linked to weak citizenship, in the sense that your feeling is there, but it's not really something which overwhelmingly determines your own persona.
How about your work? Does it have a strong impact on the work you do and the research you do?
You mean citizenship or
association to certain countries,
No,
or
I don't think. Well, I honestly don't think so. I mean, it does have certain advantages. Of course, living in the United States and knowing U.S. problems is obviously a great advantage, because when you study modern, capitalism, the U.S. is obviously the, a sort of prime example of that because of the size, importance, and technological developments and so on. On the other hand, having a East European background, and it's not only that I lived in, former Yugoslavia, I actually spent lots of time, even spoke the language in those days, which I've forgotten, Polish. And then I've spent quite a lot of time in Russia in the early 90s, and my Russian is reasonably good in terms of reading and speaking also when I have a chance. So I do have a sort of East European background in some sense, and I was always very much interested in Russian or Soviet, or rather Russian history as well. So these two things are really I think they are quite helpful. And on top of that, France, actually, because I speak French, I went to school in Belgium, and so that's the third background, which I think comes in helpful.
Mhm. In your most recent book, Capitalism Alone, I spaced that out a little bit because the title is Capitalism, comma, Alone. So
Right.
tried to give it a little bit of a pause. Um, before we get into why you named the book the way you did and the thesis of the book,
Right.
do you think, is it a myth that young people in America, for example, or developed countries, quote unquote, are don't believe in capitalism as much as, say, past generations?
Well, my impression actually from basically from reading the polls is that the young people in the United States, when it comes to the terminology, and I'll come to that, to what terminology in my opinion means, but they are much more inclined to accept socialism, at least terminologically, and to see certain features of socialism that they feel quite comfortable with. In the past, I think it was different. I think partly, and this is something that I discuss in my current book, partly because I think the US after 1945, 1950 was a very ideologically made a very significant effort to downplay the class structure within the United States in order to actually show itself to be, how should I say, richer, obviously, but also in terms of social mobility, to show itself not being inferior to what the Soviet Union projected, like in terms of social mobility, inequality, and so forth. And as we know, actually, that period was a period of a decline of inequality in the US. And then the association with certain, even the term capitalism in those days was really not considered very good, because you didn't want to emphasize that. So there was, I think, a very strong ideological emphasis on market economy, sort of American way, and so forth. Now, I think with the fall of communism and the fact that actually this communist ideology is no longer sort of a viable or significant, the term socialism, I think, to some extent has lost its negative connotation that was given to it in the United States in the 50s and the 60s. So, many people now who are older people are actually upset about that, because socialism used to be something really horrible, but the young people do not perceive it like that. And on top of that, some of the excesses of capitalism have become very, very clear now, especially with the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. Many young people will not go into all these details that you know quite well and better than I. I mean, many young people actually cannot have currently the standard of living that their parents had at their own age. So there was really a large reassessment of capitalism, which I think in that sense terminologically helped young people believe that socialism is something which can be good. And my last point on that, when I said terminologically, I want to say that they are not in favor of state ownership of the means of production. Obviously, nobody is arguing that. But they are actually saying that things like healthcare, public education, greater involvement in state in many things like infrastructure, like social assistance, unemployment benefits, regulation, and so forth, are good things. So if I define socialism like that, I would say that, of course, many young people are quite in favor of many of these things.
Mm-hmm. How much of it do you think is a lack of knowledge of what past socialist regimes uh, have done? Again, perfect example would be, like the Soviet Union, like lack of historical knowledge among young people, and how much of it is actually a response to uh, current conditions after the Great Recession and other economic factors.
I think that the second factor is crucial, and I think I would say we should not, and I'm speaking obviously from as an older person, but I think we should not expect young people to actually have the, how should I say, to be fundamentally influenced by something which for many of them is really kind of ancient history. In other words, if the Soviet Union and communism ended like 30 years ago. If you are now, like, let's suppose 40, and this is actually mid-age to some extent, you really do not have any direct experience with it, with that, really, or hardly any. So I do think actually historical knowledge is important for many reasons, but it should not be something that is going to drag us down all the time. When I was born, for example, the distance between my birth and age and the end of World War II was much smaller than the distance of somebody who is actually, I suppose, born in small, about the same, 1990s and I'm sorry, 2000s and the end of the Soviet Union in 1990. So, and I was very much interested in World War II. I know history reasonably well, but I cannot say that it was something that politically influenced me, because I thought that fascism was a thing of the past, and we are not looking back to that. And I think to some extent, communism of the planned variety and of the state-owned means of production is a thing of the past.
So you think it's a very small chance of that kind of version of socialism to come back?
I would really say, and that's what I said in Capitalism alone. I just see that I'm not sure what number I'll put, if it's 0 or 0.1, but very small, because if you look at what people argue today who are on the left, nobody argues that they're in favor of centralized coordination. People are not saying that if they're upset with Facebook or Amazon, they are not actually arguing that the US state should take over Amazon and do it by state bureaucrats. And nobody is actually saying that they would like to nationalize capital. So I don't see that, even, the countries that are, for example, at the end of the spectrum, even Cuba is basically introducing many of the things that China did, 3 decades ago. So I just think that particular form of state ownership of capital plus centralized coordination, it just doesn't seem to me that anybody is supporting that.
Okay. So what would you, and this is in your book, obviously, Capitalism Alone, but what's the difference between the kind of capitalism that we have here in the United States and the type of capitalism that exists? Well, that's the big argument that you make, the capitalism that exists in China.
Yes, that's of course the big argument. That's my whole chapter is on China. The argument that I make on China, obviously the US is a capitalist country, so let me leave that for a moment aside. So let's move on to China. Now, the argument that I make is also that China is a capitalist country. Now, that's a controversial argument, and many people disagree, but let me make my case. I base it simply on the economic structure of Chinese society, or actually of Chinese economy. I take from Marx and Max Weber a very sort of economical definition of capitalism. For them, capitalism was a society where most of the production, as we were just saying, were carried on privately owned capital. Most of labor, so that was the first. The second condition was most of labor was hired labor. That's an important part, because labor can also exercise entrepreneurial function, like in cooperatives. Then laborer is deciding. Now, in the capitalist system, worker is hired. So that's the second, part of the definition. And the third part is that it's decentralized system. So the coordination is based on a decentralized decision-making of each individual unit. Now, when I look at China, and this is in chapter 3 with quite a lot of empirical detail, I find that the first condition is satisfied, because most of the production in China is really made by private companies. The state actually produces about 20 to 25% of GDP. The second part, employment. Most of the employment is also in the private sector, actually 90%, including peasantry, farmers who work on their own land. So they are obviously they are not being hard forced, but they are not working on somebody else's land. That land, as you know, is actually under the lease system in China. But that lease system, which actually goes to 50 years, is not very different from the US, when you have also buildings which are on a lease of 99 years, but they are still the same as private. And then finally, it's decentralized coordination. However, there, of course, and that's why I think actually China fulfills all three criteria. But it is true that in China, the role of the state is incomparably stronger to the role of the state in the US. That's why I call it political capitalism. It has some other features, including absence of the rule of law, for example. There are actually, I discussed that, that are different from the US. So that's why it is capitalist in the way that this economy is overwhelmingly organized, but with the role of the state, which is much stronger than in systems of liberal capitalism. So that was the, why I used that, term, which is actually Max Weber's term, political capitalism. I could have used also state capitalism. It's used. I have nothing against that term either. I kind of like better political, but that's the issue of slight preference.
Mm-hmm. All of the points you just made about differences between American capitalism and Chinese capitalism kind of lead to one question I might have is what is the best way of measuring success in an economy? For a long time it's been GDP. A lot of people argue. I always forget what it's called, but I think it's like almost GHP, like gross happiness product,
yes, yeah.
or something like that. I don't know where most economists stand on any of these points. So what do you think is the best way to measure the health and success of an economy?
I would be old-fashioned that I actually think that actually the best way to measure it is economic growth. And I will explain why. I think economic growth is the best way, not because it is all beautiful, simply because for economic growth, sometimes you have to have the cost of economic growth are very high. And I'm not talking here only the costs, which were enormous, like suppose, collectivization under Stalin. So there was economic growth, but there was a cost of 5 million lives. Yeah. If you look at also the Industrial Revolution in the UK, that was extremely costly for people who were basically chased out from their own property through enclosures, and actually they were pushed in a system where basically they were working 15 hours a day, and as you know, of course, many of them died very young. So they were really huge costs. But we are fortunately now in a situation where we don't have to develop, we do not have to bear such enormous costs. Still, there are costs. There are costs in the destruction of environment. There are costs in destruction of people's lives. Also, I mean, in people who really work extremely hard. But the basic, I think, criterion is still economic growth, because without growth, I think that you essentially are always in danger of being defeated, quote unquote, overwhelmed by people, by other countries that are actually growing. And let me just give a small example that I actually mentioned in my book. You take a country like Italy, which has not grown in 20 years. Many people don't even know, but Italy has actually had zero growth for like one generation now. Italy is a beautiful country. You live, as we know, extremely well. The food is good. The weather is nice. This is a very lively country in terms of intellectual developments and all that. But gradually, and we see that in, for example, Venice or Florence, you will be displaced. Essentially, a Chinese guy or a Russian guy or an American person or somebody else would come and displace you because maybe you have a nice view of the Grand Canal, but somebody is going to pay more and come there. In other words, if you decide simply, I'm not going to grow, I'm going to have a nice life, eventually others who are actually growing would come to dominate. And I think that's what's happened in the past. Why, for example, the West was so dominant in the 19th century is because economically and technologically it was more advanced. So we are in a race where technological and economic development is really essential, not only in the national struggle between nations, which I'm actually against, but even within individual lifestyle. So I don't think that we have too many options, and I would actually argue that economic growth, which is compatible that I have to say, with the environmental preservation and with sort of acceptable lifestyle of people is still the criterion that should be the number one in judging different countries.
You mentioned economic growth. This is probably something I should have started off with. Um, how do you? Is it purely? How do you define economic growth?
Well, I would define it in the standard way. This is actually the sum of all the, goods and services that are being produced in a year. And there are, of course, issues there rightly raised. Actually, they have been raised since the very definition of national accounts in the 1950s. How you should account for activities that are not commercialized, because what I just defined was essentially production of goods and services that are commercialized. So only if I sell you something does it actually enter into the national account. On top of that, somebody has to know that I've sold you, because I have to report that so that I pay taxes and so forth. But there are also some activities that are non-commercialized, and that they should be also included. For example, the free work that we all do in households. In the past, it used to be mostly women, and that work is, of course, not at all counted. That actually, let me make this point, maybe people don't realize that is really biasing the data against poor countries, basically. Because in rich countries, most of the work is really commercialized. Obviously, there is still some work which is not commercialized, but probably 90% of what we do is commercialized. But if you take, for example, countries in Africa, lots of services are non-commercialized, and they are not being counted. And I encountered that since I work with household surveys, when these services in principle are included. And when I remember looking at national accounts, and in Africa, you always still have now, the situation that household surveys give you higher income because people are pushed to include that, compared to national accounts where nobody actually takes into account at all. Doesn't realize that there are services, especially that and goods too. When you produce your own food, for example, national accounts don't record it. But in household service, you ask people how much, for example, rice or potatoes or cassava you have produced, and people give you a number.
How about the overall health of an economy? So beyond the fact that we don't typically count um, unpaid work, like a mom or a father staying with their child for the first, say, 6 months to a year of their life, or the quality of a country's healthcare, a country, I'm trying to, or the fact that you could have more economic growth or increase in GDP, say you could produce more products, but you automate all your factories. So what used to employ, say, in Detroit, or like a place like Pittsburgh or Detroit, that would employ probably tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, right? All of a sudden are, it's marginally, it's a margin of that. It's so much smaller than that now, and it's heavily automated. Yet we still have more economic output, yet fewer opportunities, say, to advance to the middle class or beyond that.
Yeah, these are, I think, all excellent points. Some of that could be technically, it is actually technically included in social mobility and also in inequality numbers. But I wanted to say one thing is really important. We should never take only one indicator. As I said, I think that the GDP or national income are, you can put it like on top maybe of your indicator list, but you cannot end with that. And I think you should not also try to combine the 3 or 4 indicators into one. I think actually the advantage of having several indicators, one is social mobility that you mentioned. Secondly, ability, the age issue, for example, that we talked before, like whether the new generation has the same opportunities like their parents. Then the issues of gender and racial inequality. Then the issues of ability of getting, how should I say, acceptable, reasonable jobs. That's very important. Let me give you an example. for example, of China and in Japan recently also. Many young people are fed up with, in China, they call it like a 996 life, where they work from 9 in the morning to 9 in the evening and 6 days a week. So that, of course, increases the GDP, but it makes your life unhappy, and you work too much, and there is nothing else perhaps in your life except that. So all of these, I think, things have to be taken into account. As I said, inequality is one of the very important indicators that sort of modifies the first one, which is national income. But there are others. I've listed several of them. I would say that I would put, all of them into sort of a what is this called, the dashboard. Obviously one has to end somewhere. You cannot have 200 of them, but you certainly, I mean, if you look at inequality, if you look at social mobility, if you look at the GDP, if you look at also sustainability in terms of environment, I think these are the 4 or 5 indicators that I think are most important.
Yeah, I want to touch on the point of inequality a little bit. So that's a big part of the work you do. I'm by far not an expert on inequality. I know little to nothing about inequality, but so good opportunity to ask a question. So I hear this term income inequality in America all the time, even in the world. I think Thomas Piketty for a long time was talking about income inequality, and a lot of politicians take on this topic of
Right.
Not the economists, but more the politicians don't do a very good job of explaining what they mean by income inequality. And it's one of those terms that's strange, because I feel like if you say you have a typical 9 to 5 job, you have a family to take care of, rent to pay, whatever, you don't necessarily, do you necessarily feel that income inequality, or is it like a thing that if you read about, you're like, oh, okay, I guess that's the case?
Yeah, I think it's both, actually. Certainly, reading about that and the awareness of that makes you start thinking about the things in your own life. I think that, for example, for a very long time, going back to your earlier question, how I think these issues have been underplayed in the U.S. psyche, I think, from in the 60s and the 70s, partly because inequality was going down, but partly because there was a political pressure. If you don't have these issues up front, you may not think of them. But then a big change, I think, happened in even in the 90s and certainly in the early 2000s, where you basically suddenly the issue of inequality exploded. And I think it is, in my opinion, linked with the global financial crisis, because what the crisis actually showed is that you had people at the very top, sometimes who were profiting a lot during the 90s, and then the crisis hit, and still they were doing very well, and in some cases even the government actually bailed them out. But what happened to the middle income people? Then they suddenly realized many of what they thought actually was acceptable increase in the consumption pattern, standard of living, was based on borrowing. So they had actually problem repaying that, and of course, as you know, many of the housing was lost, was taken, repossessed. So suddenly they realized, well, something is really not working well, and then the term inequality, I think, sort of took off because it reflected what people sort of felt. But until the term became global, broadly acceptable, they may not have actually known what they felt. So it's a little bit like take the COVID. If you just feel like you're sick, but nobody tells you, is it the flu or is it a cold or is it COVID? You don't know. Once you have actually the definition, and I think income inequality came at that point, and that's why there was, the movement in, top 1%, against the top 1%. We are all 99, and so on. It actually sharpened or gave how should I say, gave understanding or meaning to what people might have felt without being able to fully verbalize it.
Uh-huh.
So I think to go back really to try to answer your question precisely, I would say both elements are important. It's important for you to feel something, but it's important for you to get knowledge about what it is that you're feeling. So it is really a double, two components, I think, are necessary in this case.
Right. And that I think that's an interesting point. But again, with the political case more so, when they say the top 1% owns, I always forget. So I'm going to put X amount of capital, which is probably like 90% or more of whatever they say. Um, my question all the time is, and what am I supposed to do about it? Like, what can you do?
Yeah.
And to the point you made earlier, and you said, the kind of the old school view of socialism, right? So it's a top down redistribution kind of model that's you put 0 to 1% of coming back, kind of starts, especially for older people, I would imagine, when they hear, oh, the top 1% owns 90% of wealth, and then they say, we need to do XYZ, they hear it's top down redistribution and it's old school socialism. That's why I think earlier on I was pushing back a little bit on the fact that should we know what the old way of viewing socialism was, even though it doesn't really exist in the world anymore.
Yeah, obviously, I'm in favor of, yes, of course, people should know, because I agree with you that not knowing history is quite dangerous. But on the other hand, if the current conditions are very different from the historical conditions, that particular thing does not have a huge impact on what young people think. But when you say it like, what can I do? I always say, well, as individuals, really, we can do nothing practical about inequality. You can actually go and give some charitable contributions or whatever, but it really is a drop in the ocean. To sort of reduce inequality, what the society needs is a social action. Social action comes only from the sort of coordination of individual decisions, which are done through the political process. So it is only through the political process that one can influence inequality. Now, I'm not forgetting that there are other forces like technological change, for example, globalization, and others which are really economic and technological forces that really have nothing to do with you or me or anybody else. But the social action is the only sort of conscious force that we can use, which means basically political decision, political influence, to change distribution. And that indeed means changing things like regulation, taxation policies, social transfers, involvement of the state in many things, including, for example, health and education. So it does actually, that's where individuals do have a role. But as persons, as alone, even somebody like Bill Gates, who has actually been involved, as you know, with malaria and all of that, obviously billionaires can have some influence, but it's still a limited influence, and we should not rely, I definitely think we should not rely at all on billionaires deciding what are our political preferences. So it's really through political action, and I'm actually, that's why I'm, how should I say, very disappointed by the fact that more and more we have rich people deciding the agenda. They are doing it either directly by giving money or indirectly by funding political campaigns. And I think it's a dangerous development, because eventually ordinary people like you or me or somebody else, we will have, the only option would be basically we go once every 2 years or every 4 years, we put a vote. That vote itself is basically can be manipulated by what we hear on, on the media. So basically you empty out that political involvement. And that's why I think actually inequality is very dangerous, because it enables people who have so much money to dictate the political process.
So you just gave a outline through social action and through all these things that you can make a change in income inequality. Let's say that a person listens to this podcast, or myself, accepts your argument. what again, you said regulations, education, healthcare,
Taxation.
and taxation. Can you give, without, obviously this could be a whole book and a whole 4-hour thing,
Yeah.
but kind of a brief overview of what you can do in each of those 4 categories that would make a dent in improving income distribution.
Yeah, towards the end of Capitalism alone, and that's the same thing in my previous book, Global Inequality, I came with some, how should I say, proposals, recommendations, or whatever you want to call them. And I was intentionally not very specific, because I think that these policies, and I'll list them in a minute, these policies have to be really sort of tailored to the conditions of different countries and different times. But let me just give them the broad sort of outline. The first one has to do with reduction of the ability of rich families to transfer the advantages to their children, full advantages to their children. In other words, this is really the issue of social mobility and social equality. And how do you solve it? I think there are 2 instruments that are actually already found in John Rawls' theory of justice. The first one is heavy taxation of inheritance above a certain limit, which doesn't mean that, if you have an inheritance of $10,000, that the state should grab that money. It means that if that inheritance goes into millions, the state, and it's very often actually transferred from generation to generation through these trusts, which are not being taxed, that money should be taxed. So you really have a strong taxation of large inheritances. Secondly, public education is absolutely crucial, because its function is exactly the same as the function of taxing inheritance. It is not allowing, through the private education and through money, to buy the top positions in society for your offspring, because that's where the role of the public education is. Give to everybody the same opportunity and make public education actually better than private, so that everybody wants to go precisely to public schools, so that they get actually better jobs and higher income. So that's where the rationale for public education comes in. So these are the 2 policies. And the third one, which is more difficult but should be kept in mind, is giving a greater ability for the middle class to actually acquire assets that are generally now, basically financial assets that are generally now owned by only the top of the income distribution, which means give different tax preferences to ordinary middle class to invest and have some financial returns, so that they don't depend only on labor, but also have financial returns. For example, it is done with pension systems, but it can be extended. And finally, this is number 4, and the last one, try to break the link between the wealth and rich people and the political process. Because if you go at these 4 points, what you notice there is that the 3 out of them, so the first 2 about inheritance, public education, and the last one about funding of the political campaigns, are in all cases an attempt of really breaking the link between one's wealth now and ability to influence future decisions, political decisions, and of course to influence the future career of their children, regardless of their own abilities. So that's my approach. And then whether you would have one tax or the other tax, it really is. I don't think we can say that the tax rate should be 42% or 45%. This is a result of the political process and the horse trading between the political parties. But these main, I think, directions, I think, are broadly, how should I say, are fairly broad, but they are also fairly specific in the sense that you understand what is the objective of those policies.
Yeah, that's a good arguments and very fascinating things that definitely people should read about in your books. I usually end the podcast with 2 questions. but because we're going into a new year, I want to experiment with something else. Before we get to the two questions, I want to do kind of a quick rapid fire round of questions, probably 5 or 6 questions, and then
Okay.
first thing that comes to mind, try to answer. If you had a backup career instead of going into economics, what would it be?
Sociology. Not very different.
Okay. What is the one big thing that you learned in 2021?
That I've become very skeptical of epidemiologists.
Oh man, that would be a good topic to expand on. What is the coolest fact about economics that you've learned?
Coolest fact.
Hmm?
Fact. Cool.
Yeah, fact. Coolest fact. Yes.
Well, I'm not sure if it's a fact, but let me put it like that. I think that it was said, actually, Samuelson said that the simplest and the more difficult part of economics is actually theory of comparative advantage. It's difficult because you have to understand that actually, even if you're better in two things that you are working on, you should not work both of them, and we should divide this between each of us. So it's really kind of difficult to understand at first, and then secondly, if you understand it, then actually it becomes pretty cool because you said, "Wow, this is actually so simple, and I never figured it out before."
Mm-hmm. Who's your idol?
In economics or in soccer
or just in
well,
life?
in football, I would say it's Maradona, so it's easier. And whom I would say in economics, because I'm writing now a book, I would say I really like classical economists. I like Ricardo and I like Marx.
Okay. What is your favorite soccer team?
My favorite, that I really, when I was a kid, actually in Belgrade, there were two big teams. They're still competing, Partizan and Red Star. But I was never really very much for either. So with my father, who also tried to avoid making decisions, we actually were fans of the third one, which was Belgrade called, but it was really now relegated probably in the third league.
Messi or Ronaldo?
Difficult one. I would say Ronaldo because I like his work ethic.
Okay. And now, outside of the rapid fire round, two questions that I end every podcast with. I'm going to bundle them together and you can answer in whatever order.
Right.
The second one might be a lot easier for you because you talk about it on your Twitter feed and all that. So what gives you hope for the future is the first question. And the second question is, what are 5 books, fiction or nonfiction, that you would recommend to people?
Okay, what gives me, these are difficult questions, actually. What gives me, I'm not particularly optimistic about the future, but because of the question that you asked me, I have to be optimistic. I actually think that the optimistic part is that precisely that many young people are rejecting this sort of nostrums or truism that were actually true in the past. And I think the advent of new technologies which make many things possible, including contacts with people whom you would have never met in your life. Even if you lived 1,000 years, you would have never met them, never learned anything from them. It gives me really makes me optimistic. But there are many other things that make me pessimistic, but we will skip that because we wish everybody to have a nice and happy new year. The books, should I go into fiction or should I include nonfiction?
Like I said, fiction or nonfiction, you can do both. A lot of people mix
up both. It's so difficult. I would say, let me start with nonfiction because, with fiction, because that's something that very often we discuss at the dinner table, so it's easier for me to do it. I actually think, in my opinion, that the best book ever, that's maybe exaggeration, but one of the certainly best structured books were Anna Karenina and Madame Bovary. So these are my sort of really best fiction books. And then I think, and believe it or not, I've read the entire In Search of Lost Time by Proust, which I think is also phenomenal. And from time to time, I still read. I mean, it's impossible now for me to read all of it, but I read like the last book, Le Temps Retrouvé, and the first one. So that would be for if I include, like, I suppose, 3 fiction. And history, I would definitely say Gibbon, the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. That's again a huge number of books, but I would always say to people, this reads much better than any sort of historical novel, because there are so many horrible and extraordinary things that happen there that you basically read it like a story, because it is a story after all. So that would be my number 4. So did I leave? Well, I like economic historians. For example, Brodel is somebody whom I like very much. So maybe I would put him as you have noticed, these are more a sort of historical books. So I put them as my favorite. Let me see. I must have missed some, but I've got 5, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I've got Anna Karenina, Madame Bovary, Proust, Brodel, and Gibbon.
Yeah.
Okay, can I put the 6th one?
Sure.
Machiavelli.
Okay.
Okay, so that would be it.
So to your point about hope for the future, if I've never been in your classroom, if I've never, even if I've read your book, probably 20 years ago or 10 years ago, it'd be very difficult to get in touch with you. And I'm extremely privileged and lucky to have had a chance to have a conversation with you. So thank you for being my last conversation of 2021, and I hope to do it in 2022 again.
I'm actually first, thank you very much for excellent questions. They were not all very easy, but they're really good. Made me sort of try to think harder than normal. And of course, I'm pleased and delighted actually to be the last host of the last guest of 2021. And I really wish to all of us, this is really, I think, sincere wish that 2022 be better than what we have witnessed in the last 2 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks
Thank
a lot.